Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 974 for October 16th, 2022. Coming up in a few minutes.
The bit that I like about whiskey is the heritage, its culture, its role in society, that not just our own society, but in a global perspective. You could go to pretty much any country in the world and there'll be a bottle of scotch sitting behind the bar, and for a little country tucked on the edge of Europe, that's quite a feat.
Stewart Morrison is part of the blending team at Diageo, and he's responsible for blending Lagavulin's single malts, including the latest Offerman Edition release in conjunction with actor Nick Offerman. We'll talk about the process of creating that whiskey and other Lagavulin malts with Stewart Morrison on WhiskyCast In-Depth. I'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, your voice, behind the label, and much more. The news is next, all on this week's WhiskyCast.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Hiya, Mark. How's my favourite Redbreast fan doing? Look, I'm going to address the elephant in the room right away. We both know your podcast is dying for a co-host. And I know just the lad who can be the Robin to your Batman. How's that for dropping a hint?
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Gabriel Cardarella here with Dewar's Whiskey, inviting you to enjoy this episode of WhiskyCast with a glass of Dewar's, the most awarded blended Scotch whiskey in history.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. With Halloween coming up, now's the time for scary stories, but this story is bound to send real chills down the spines of Islay whiskey lovers. There's a shortage of peated Islay malt coming over the next couple of years. Master of Malts Henry Jeffries broke the news this week that Diageo's Port Ellen Maltings is running short of capacity to supply outside clients. The malting's principal purpose is to supply Lagavulin, Kalila, and now the revived Port Ellen distillery with peated malt. Diageo has been using the excess capacity at the maltings to supply outside clients for years now, but with Kalila running 7 days a week now and Port Ellen coming back online, that excess capacity is disappearing quickly. The maltings supplies almost every distillery on the island except for Bruichladdich, which works with a maltster on the Scottish mainland. Laphroaig, Bowmore, and Kilchoman all have their own floor maltings, but they don't produce enough to supply 100% of the distillery's needs. According to Jeffries, the word on Islay is that non-Diageo distilleries will see a cut in malt supply next year and be cut off completely in 2024. Diageo executives are not denying that, but declined to be more specific on their commercial supply contracts for the coming years. It's not as simple as replacing malt from Port Ellen with mainland malt. The maltsters on the mainland are running at full capacity as well and seeking planning permission for expansion projects. Meanwhile, Ardbeg is cranking up the peat levels on its latest release. Hypernova is an evolution of the old Supernova releases and is peated to more than 170 parts per million of phenols, making it the peatiest Ardbeg yet. By comparison, Ardbeg's usual releases are around 45 parts per million. Hypernova is an Ardbeg committee release and will sell for around $200 a bottle. I'll have my tasting notes for it soon at the WhiskyCast website. U.S. whiskey makers are starting to see export sales rebound following the removal of punitive tariffs by the European Union and the United Kingdom. A new report from the Distilled Spirits Council shows American whiskey exports between January and July of this year rose by 22% over the same period a year ago. That's on top of last year's gains, though nowhere near the pre-tariff levels of 2018. The EU tariff remains suspended until January 1st of 2024, while the two sides work out agreements on steel and aircraft disputes. We have distilleries celebrating anniversaries this week. Rocktown Distillery in Little Rock, Arkansas is marking 12 years with a new Arkansas single malt whiskey finished in a recharred sherry cask. The cask was also used to mature their 7th anniversary release 5 years ago and was recharred after that. It's available exclusively at the distillery in Little Rock. And Brooklyn's Widow Jane Distillery celebrated its 10th anniversary with a party Thursday night, along with 2 new releases, the Paradigm Rye and the 10th Anniversary Bourbon. Here's Master Distiller Lisa Wicker.
It just happened that Paradigm Rye, it just happened at the timetable that we released it for this anniversary party. We decided to hold it. And then we have our 10-year anniversary blend because our 10-year is our flagship and our staple, that we always keep in the pipeline.
But the Paradigm Rye is unique because it's got your distillate in it, right?
It has just Widow Jane produced distillate in it. We have 2 source whiskeys in it, one from Kentucky, one from Indiana. Then we have rye whiskey that I laid down at Castle and Key, on behalf of Widow Jane, because we still haven't finished building our new distillery here. And then we have rye whiskey that actually an all-woman team here laid down 4 years ago. And we have a little bit of that. And Sienna, our head distiller here, is still overseeing that project, and she's actually running a little bit of rye right now.
And I hear tell you're filing permits tomorrow for a brand new distillery.
That is correct. Yeah, absolutely. We put it on ice for a couple of years during COVID, but we're back up and running. We have the most amazing engineering pool, structural engineers, process engineers, MEP, and the architects are pod architects that did Rabbit Hole in Louisville. Yeah.
So construction in a couple of years from now, theoretically, or before then?
I hope so. COVID's knocked everybody off their game, not knowing exactly when things are going to happen. But right now we seem to be back up and running, and permitting seems to be happening on time. So hopefully we'll be breaking ground in January if it all falls together. And we'd like to think it's going to be an 18-month construction window. I don't know how realistic that is, but we sure hope so. Right.
What does it mean to you to be here for the 10th anniversary of Widow Jane?
It's remarkable. I've been here 5.5 years personally. Samson Distillery purchased them 6 years ago. Part of our team, Raphael, our bottling manager, Sienna, our head distiller, and Michelle Clark, our vice president and director of operations, they've all been here for 10 years. And so they have been able to see the entire progression. I've learned from them all of the stories and all of the ups and downs with the brand, and was able to come in. It's fun to be here for over half of its life. Yeah.
The new distillery will be located about 5 blocks away from the original distillery on the Brooklyn waterfront. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com and on our social media timelines. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. Whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
If you missed Friday night's Happy Hour Live webcast with Ashok Chokalingam of Amrut and Raj Sabarwal of Glass Revolution Imports, the on-demand replay is available right now on the WhiskyCast YouTube channel. No live webcast this week. I'll be traveling in Ireland. Listen to next week's podcast from Dublin. In the meantime, we are still looking for volunteers to help us test out a new project. If you're interested, send an email to comments@whiskycast.com and we'll give you the details. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. Bourbon's Bistro in Louisville hosts a charity bourbon dinner for Eastern Kentucky flood relief this Thursday night. That same night is Whiskey and Barrel Night in Los Angeles and the Los Angeles Magazine Whiskey Festival in Long Beach. The Manchester Whiskey Festival is this Friday and Saturday in Manchester, England. The Dornoch Whiskey Festival is the weekend of October 28th through the 30th in Dornoch, Scotland. Whiskey Fest San Francisco is on October 28th. Whiskies of the World is in Atlanta on the 29th. And New York City's Fine and Rare hosts a Compass Box tasting with John Glazer on November 1st, just ahead of Whiskey Fest New York on the 3rd. If you're organizing a whiskey event, please let us know about it. We'll add it to the searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. The calendar is brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of the Virginia Rye Whiskey. You'll find their Roundstone Rye at fine whiskey shops in 26 U.S. states, 3 continents, and online. Visit the new buyvirginiarye.com site for more details, and please drink responsibly.
Dewar's master blender Stephanie McLeod's innate curiosity, combined with her passion for whiskey maturation, cask finishing, and blending, has created some truly incredible expressions for Dewar's Scotch whiskey. It's also earned her 4 consecutive Master Blender of the Year titles at the International Whiskey Competition, making her the first person to achieve such an accolade. Her innovative spirit is the inspiration behind the ultra-premium Dewar's Double 32 Year, the highest-rated blended Scotch whiskey in the world with a score of 94.4. So whether you consider yourself a whiskey connoisseur or just want to find an exciting new whiskey experience, consider one of Stephanie's other masterful expressions, including Dewar's 15-year, Double 21-year, or Dewar's 8-year Mizunara cask finish, and discover just how rewarding curiosity can be. Enjoy responsibly.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlock and the Classic Malts lineup. Unless you're drinking a single cask bottling, every whiskey that you drink has been blended in one way or another, and even those single casks get a blender's scrutiny too. Stewart Morrison has been part of Diageo's blending team for the last decade, working on both blended Scotch whiskies and single malts. He's responsible for the Lagavulin portfolio, including the new 3rd release in the Offerman Edition series, where he collaborated with actor Nick Offerman to create a whiskey designed to go well with a steak. Stewart made the trip from Scotland for the Offerman Edition launch party Wednesday night in New York City, and we sat down for a chat. Walk me through the process for creating the Offerman 11-year-old Charred Oak Edition.
So, with the Lagavulin Offerman Charred Oak Edition, we have released, this is the 3rd edition. So the 1st edition was matured in refill casks and rejuvenated oak, and the 2nd one was a Guinness cask finish, and this one we decided to use entirely rejuvenated casks. And the idea was to create a whiskey that was perfectly suited to be served with steak, well charred steak.
How do you accomplish a balance, though, to make it so that somebody who's not having a steak can enjoy it on its own?
That's a really good point. I think with a whiskey with a quality as good as Lagavulin, that you do design it to be able to be served neat. But it was something that was kept in mind, that it's not just designed just to be served with steak. It's a bit like sometimes you'll create a whiskey that's maybe designed to be consumed long, but at the same time it's resilient enough and it has enough character to be served on its own.
Most of the whiskies you create do not have somebody's name on them, unlike this one. Tell me about the process of working with someone whose name is on the bottle, like Nick Offerman.
It's such an incredible pleasure just to work with Nick, and it's quite an organic partnership. There's obviously a bit of lineage going back to the Parks and Recreation, Ron Swanson, the Tales of Whiskey shorts that were done in the past. And somewhere in the middle is just this mutual love and admiration for Lagavulin. And it's just created this opportunity where the passions obviously meet in the middle, and you've got a process that you go through, that you share ideas and share concepts and share liquids and discuss it back and forth until you reach an amicable point, until you reach your conclusion. It can be quite a long process, but it's still it's still the love of whiskey that joins everything together.
You have the chance to work with a lot of different single malts at Diageo. What makes Lagavulin so special?
Lagavulin's an absolute icon. It's one of the most well-known, much-loved Islay whiskies. It's such a fantastic whiskey. And yeah, there may have been other whiskies that we potentially could have explored, but Lagavulin was the one. That was the one that had the strong association. That was where Nick's love of the whiskey came about. And
I'm talking about your blending experience. What makes it good for you in terms of your blending knowledge and experience?
Lagavulin's great to work with. It's just such a unique whiskey. Each of our distilleries creates its own unique whiskey and its own unique style and has its own unique flavour. But Lagavulin is something special. The flavour it gives, the level of peatiness it gives, it's not just about the peatiness, it's about the layers of flavour that are contained beneath it. Those red berry characters that you get, that subtle orchard fruit, of course it's there sitting beneath the peat, but it just gives something that's just got a wonderful depth of character.
How'd you get started in blending to begin with?
That's a really good question. I think my answer to that is just to be at the right place at the right time. When I was towards the end of my time at university, I made a bit of a concerted effort to consider what I wanted to do, and the phrase that stuck in my mind that my parents told me was, if you're going to spend 5 days a week doing something, just make sure you do something that you love. So I made the effort to get into the whisky industry, and the door opened just at the right time. So I joined Diageo's whisky team in 2012, and here we are over 10 years later. I get to work with these amazing whiskies, and yeah, I feel incredibly lucky every day just to get to work with these individuals, these groups with these whiskies. No 2 days are the same. Absolute pleasure.
Who were your mentors getting started? Were you working with Jim Beveridge and Maureen Robinson?
That's correct. So Jim and Maureen have both recently retired, but they were hugely influential in the early stages of my career. Myself and Maureen, we worked together at our old site at Carsbridge. Our desks backed onto one another, and yeah, she was probably one of the biggest mentors in my career, up until she just retired in the summer just past.
What did she teach you?
It's absolutely everything that they teach you. So, the first of all, you take it back to basics. The liquids, understanding liquids, understanding distilleries, distillery character, what each of them brings, understand how to design a recipe, and then you kind of get into the stuff that doesn't really get spoken about: the sustainability, longevity, inventory management, cask policies, how to manage projects, how to manage stakeholders, keeping everyone happy. So from the nuts and bolts to how to make whiskey to the wider experiential things that really go a long way to making sure that bottlings that are released are quite successful.
It's a lot more than just sniffing whiskies and putting them together, right?
Absolutely. If I sat down and said to you I spent 5 days a week nosing and creating whiskies, I wouldn't be telling the truth. A lot of my time is spent with stakeholders, coming up with concepts, engaging with markets. There's a lot of time spent in front of the computer, understanding the inventory, scrutinising it, trying to understand where you're going to be in a year's time, 5 years' time, 10, 20 years' time. There's things that we're doing today that we're making decisions on liquid that it will still be sitting in cask by the time I retire, and even beyond that. So we're hugely beneficial of, or we're beneficiaries of the decisions that people make, or decisions that people have made a long time ago. So as a whisky maker, we're eternally grateful for the whiskies that people have made, people that we'll never know of and never even see, or paths will never cross.
When you're making a whiskey that you're laying down a stock that you're never going to be able to taste, that you're never going to bottle because your successors are going to bottle it, what's that feel like?
I think if you say that you're doing things with and you're laying down whiskies that you'll never be around to see it. For some people it can sound quite morbid, but if you look at the bigger picture, that we're selecting casks that the generation before have laid down for us. So all we're doing is just paying it forward. We work in massive spans of time when you're dealing with whiskey. Whiskey can only ever be called whiskey if it's at least 3 years old, and it maybe doesn't seem a long time in whiskey circles, but it's still quite a long time, and 36 months is quite a while. So if you look at it that way, once you get your head around it, you just appreciate it. So as a team, we're laying down stocks that will become Johnnie Walker Black Label in 2034. Seems quite a long while away, but it's not really. The past 10 years that I've been in this industry have gone by in a flash, so hopefully I'll be around to see those casks being turned into Black Label in 12 years' time.
When did you first realize that you had a nose for blending whiskey?
I think I always had an appreciation for whiskey. The bit that I like about whiskey is the heritage, its culture, its role in society, that not just our own society, but in a global perspective. You could go to pretty much any country in the world and there'll be a bottle of scotch sitting behind the bar, and for a little country tucked on the edge of Europe, that's quite a feat. So that appreciation for whiskey really goes back a long way for me. And I suppose it's just enjoying whiskey with friends and enjoying the diversity of flavour. But I only really appreciated that I had a nose and a palate was actually when I joined Diageo. So as part of the recruitment process, they assess your nose and capability, and I suppose it was only then that officially someone's told you how good or not so good your capability was in particular flavour areas.
Tell me about that test. Were you nervous going in?
I don't think I was nervous. I just think I wanted to do a really good job. Because I really wanted to be part of this industry, you just had to be laser focused on doing the best that you could. If I gave everything and it wasn't enough, then at least you gave everything.
Of all the whiskies you've created over the last 10 years, do you have a favourite?
To be in a position where you get to create and make whiskies is such a luxury and such a privilege in its own right. The Offerman whiskies that we've made, and we're enjoying the Offerman whiskies tonight, they have to be up there. As part of my day-to-day, I get to be involved in whiskies in our brand homes and our visitor centres and creating those liquids. I get to look after our, what you would perhaps term core variants, things like Talisker 10, Lagavulin 16. I get to look after them on a day-to-day basis, and yeah, there might be one or two that feel maybe just that little bit special, but all the whiskies that we make are absolutely fantastic, and it is an incredible privilege to be able to do that every single day.
Last question, do you have your own blend that you keep at home?
Not per se, no. I don't keep a blend there. I think I have a lot of open bottles at home, and myself and my wife, we enjoy our dram of an evening, and one night you can maybe have a smoky whiskey, next minute you could have a nice fruity one. You can maybe finish off the week with a nice blue label. I know I'll be going home and enjoying some Offerman 11-year-old charred oak cask when I get back home on Friday night, back home to Scotland. So yeah, I think we're lucky to have a good range of whiskies at home, that wherever your palate wants to take you, there's always something at the end of the road.
Thanks to Diageo's Stewart Morrison for joining us on this week's WhiskyCast In-Depth. It's brought to you by Mortlock, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlock lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Let's begin with the Lagavulin Offerman Edition Charred Oak Single Malt. It's bottled at 46% ABV, and the nose is full of campfire smoke, honey, heather, and butterscotch. The taste is peaty and phenolic with a nice touch of creosote and notes of charred oak, citrus, and honey underneath with a good balance. The finish, long and smoky with touches of charred oak and honey. I'm scoring the Lagavulin Offerman Edition Charred Oak a 93. Let's look at another peated single malt now, this one from India, where Amrut has become the first independent bottler of single malts from the country's other distilleries with its Single Malts of India series. Nidal is the word Indians use to refer to coastal regions, and this peated single malt comes from a coastal distillery. It's bottled at 46% ABV. The nose is smoky and pungent with touches of tar and creosote, balanced by honey, vanilla, and a hint of dark chocolate. The taste starts off light and fruity before the peatiness kicks in and builds to a nice peak along with touches of lemon zest, honey, and chocolate in the background. The finish is long and smoky, and I'm scoring the Single Malts of India Nidal an 88. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit, a 100-time award-winning Maryland-style rye whiskey. With a determined focus to create the best rye whiskey imaginable, their team of distillers crafts each spirit with a nod to both tradition and innovation. Find their signature, double oak, cask strength, or reserve series of rye whiskeys, as well as their line of premium rye whiskey canned cocktails at a retailer near you. Visit sagamorespirit.com/find-rye. Please drink responsibly. Had the chance to taste both of Widow Jane's 10th anniversary releases the other night. Let's start off with the Paradigm Rye. As Lisa Wicker told us, it includes some of Widow Jane's own New York rye for the first time. It's bottled at 46.5% ABV, and the nose has touches of baking spices, honey, butterscotch, vanilla, and dried fruits. The taste has gentle, spicy notes of cinnamon and clove, balanced by honey, butterscotch, and dried fruits, while the finish is nice and long with lingering spices. I'm scoring the Widow Jane Paradigm Rye a 92. Meanwhile, the 10th anniversary Widow Jane 10-year-old bourbon is a blend of bourbons from Kentucky, Indiana, and Tennessee, bottled at 50% ABV. The nose on this one has touches of caramel, leather, and a hint of tobacco, along with dried apple chips, cherries, and honeycomb. The taste is aromatic and spicy with white pepper and allspice notes, complemented by black cherries, vanilla, caramel, leather, tobacco, and honeycomb. The finish is long and spicy with a touch of charred oak and dried fruits. I'm scoring the Widow Jane 10th anniversary 10-year-old bourbon a 93. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I'm adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 3,400 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Kentucky and Ireland have plenty in common. Two homes of horse racing. Bluegrass music is said to have Irish roots. Okay, it's not the longest list, but the Redbreast Kentucky Oak Edition only strengthens the bond. Finished in sustainably sourced Kentucky oak for a captivating nose and round taste. I see a triple crown in this thoroughbred's future.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Time now for Your Voice, presented by Scarabus Islay Single Malt Scotch Whiskey. Had some interesting comments on the Master of Malt blog story about the coming shortage of Islay peated malt. Chris Ratcliffe had this to say: "This reminds me of when some distilleries were giving up contract distilling because their own bottlings were seeing demand rise so much. I get Diageo being unwilling to expand capacity if they've essentially been selling their excess to offset the costs involved. I wonder how many distilleries or groups will consider making their own maltings now, and what sort of volumes would need to be malted to make them viable. Well, it's not as simple as building a new maltings on the island by itself. Keep in mind that most of the barley used on the island comes from the Scottish mainland and has to be shipped to Islay by ferry or barge. The shipping system is already stretched to the limit, and with more distilleries coming online in the next couple of years, there are going to have to be some infrastructure needs addressed to allow for that growth. Doc Martin had this response to Chris's comment: "It would take a huge change in volume. Just thinking of Lafroig's malting floor, which seems a decent size, is a minuscule amount versus the amount of liquid they produce. Kilhoman's floor is small, and even with their limited production, I don't think it comes close either. My guess is someone is going to have to build their own production, but will there be enough Islay peat?" There is plenty of peat on the island, but harvesting it could be another potential problem. Many of the bogs lie in protected wildlife areas, and there are limits on the amount of peat that can be harvested each year. It's hard to say whether those limits are being bumped up against with current demand. If you have a question, suggestion, or anything else you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always find me on social media. Look for WhiskyCast on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, or you can just email me. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your Voice is presented by Scarabus, the Islay single malt from Hunter Lang & Company that celebrates all of Islay's natural gifts in one bottle. Only those who seek shall find Scarabus. Start your search at hunterlang.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. Every distiller has their eyes on the competition, how they'd run those distilleries differently, or which ones are on their bucket list to run someday. Alan Winchester oversaw production at all of the Chivas Brothers distilleries in Scotland, along with being master distiller for the Glenlivet. And even he had his eye on a couple of distilleries he'd like to run given the chance. He joined us on last week's Happy Hour Live webcast.
Glenmore in Inverness and Glenlochy in Port William at the either end of the Caledonian Canal. Glenmore simply because it's my my grandfather's uncle built the distillery, and Glenlochy because my mother's great uncle was manager of it. We've found out now that he only made whiskey for a few years, but he was in with Joseph Hobbs when it was bought over by Joseph Hobbs. He moved from Clydesdale to Glenlochy via Ballychan. It's now peated Edredour, and he was also at Clydesdale Distillery, but Cragganmore. Cragganmore, a great birthplace, a lot of distillers. So that's the two I would love to get in about.
As we heard a few weeks ago, Alan Winchester is keeping busy with the Cabrac Trust's new community distillery in Scotland. He'll also be presenting this year's Closed Distilleries Masterclass at the New Brunswick Spirits Festival next month. It's already sold out. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of past episodes going all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
Well, folks, we're nearing the end of another great episode of WhiskyCast, which means you're probably craving some whiskey. Head on over to Dewar's.com or your local retailer to discover what makes Dewar's the most awarded blended Scotch whiskey in the world.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
People never forget the person who introduced them to Redbreast. And then those people go on to introduce others to Redbreast. And soon the flock has grown exponentially. It's like a pyramid scheme. Without any of the bad stuff, of course.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2022, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.